Of course, my case is one of the first cases, I believe, anywhere in the world where a court has judged that there is a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and that the anti-Zionism which I espouse and espoused in court documents, written in my witness statement, was worthy of respect in a democratic society.
War crimes. The very word conjures images of atrocities we'd like to believe are relics from the past. Genocide. Deliberate targeting of civilians, wiping out entire communities. We tell ourselves that surely the world would act if it knew, if it truly understood the scale of what is happening. But what if it does know? What if the silence, the inaction, isn't just a failure to respond, but a carefully orchestrated complicity? Welcome back to Solcube Analytics, where we challenge mainstream narratives and dive deep into global events. I'm Thomas Karat, your host, presenting weekly insights from recognized thought leaders like diplomats, academics, intelligence experts, and sometimes activists of some sort. So join us as we uncover the hidden stories beneath the headlines. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble, X, TikTok, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any of your other preferred podcast platforms. And if you want to discover more about how Western media and politicians shape and control the narrative, a topic covered in the interview, join me on Substack. It's free and you get unfiltered, in-depth analysis without big tech algorithms and bias. A link is in the description below. Today I'm speaking with a man who has spent his entire career dissecting these grim truths. Professor David Miller, a former academic whose work has led him straight into the hornet's nest, where realpolitik, money and unspoken alliances dictate who matters, who is sacrificed, and nowhere is this clearer than in the case of Gaza. You may think you know this story, the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? The very term conflict obscures the severe power imbalance, systemic control, and humanitarian impact of Israel's actions in Gaza. It downplays the reality of domination and potential war crimes while misleadingly suggesting a certain parity and mutual aggression. This word is used by Western leaders and media to assure us of their neutrality. But David argues that this neutrality is a deadly illusion. His research dives into the hidden networks of influence, examining how Western powers and pro-Israel lobbies in the US and Europe shape the narrative, how they sanitize or outright erase the brutal reality of Gaza under siege. We are talking about civilians deliberately targeted, children shot, homes bombed, entire neighborhoods virtually erased from the map, and we are talking about Western leaders who are not only aware, but complicit. Evolutionary psychology tells us that as social creatures, we instinctively rely on authorities to tell us what's right and wrong, who is good and who is evil. Miller contends that this instinct is being used against us, that our need to conform to social norms is being manipulated by powerful lobbies, corporate media, and political elites, all working to suppress the reality of Israeli actions in Gaza. When you see these events framed as Israel has the right to self-defense, ask yourself, is that really so? Has an occupying power the right to self-defense in the territories it occupies? And Western complicity in the greatest tragedy since the Second World War isn't just about passive silence. It's an active choice to shield certain powers while leaving others defenseless. Tonight, David will dissect the psychological warfare of narrative control, how Western media softens brutality into defensive measures, and how a powerful pro-Israel lobby has influenced even the language we use to talk about Palestinian lives. By the end, we will confront questions that cut deep. Are we being guided to look away, to dismiss, to excuse? And if so, by whom? But before we do, a quick call to action. Some of the best interviews on this channel are shadow banned, which means YouTube is not presenting them to you, the viewer. The latest example is my interview with James Bamford, where we discussed the truly amazing story that underlies Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption scandal. Did you know that a Hollywood billionaire not only stole nuclear secrets from America, but then sold them to Israel? And that Netanyahu helped him to stay out of troubles to this very day? And then Netanyahu turned around and started to ask for favors, hence the bribery charges in Israel against him. Other examples are the interviews with the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen, or the interview with the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, who told me that the white powder in the test tube that Colin Powell showed the world when he testified at the UN just before the war on Iraq was actually salt. So if you're interested in content that apparently you're not supposed to see, content that goes against the mainstream narrative, have a look at some of the previous interviews that we have recorded for your pleasure. And of course, it really helps to spread the news if you like and subscribe to this channel. David Miller, or better, Professor David Miller, really thank you for joining. It's really appreciated that you take the time. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
I have a couple of notes in front of me, and I have to say I follow your, how should I say it, your, I don't want to say drama, yeah, but your challenges since I think 2019. So I know you have spoken many times about this on the on various interviews, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But in a nutshell, encapsulate in whatever 2-3 minutes what happened to you between 2019 and 2021.
So in 2019, I had just been appointed as Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol in September previously. And in February 2019, I gave a lecture on Islamophobia in my class, which is called Harms of the Powerful, criminology class. And during that lecture, for approximately 2 minutes and 44 seconds in a 2-hour lecture, I discussed the role of Zionists in pushing and encouraging Islamophobia based on research that I had done. This led to some students in the class, 2 students complaining to an Israel lobby group who complained to the university. The university rejected it because the Israel lobby group was not a student. And then the Israel lobby group encouraged the Union of Jewish Students and its Bristol branch, the Bristol Jewish Society, to complain. The university took that complaint, rejected it. They then appealed that rejection. The university appointed a QC who took about a year to investigate me, and I did a huge long report assessing basically everything I'd ever said, including back to some 5 or 6 years before I'd started at Bristol, and concluded that nothing I'd ever said, not a sentence, not a clause, not a comma, not a full stop, was in any way anti-Semitic. Then the university refused to publicise the results of that inquiry, and I 6 weeks later went on a public meeting and said, I have been attacked and complained about by the Union of Jewish Students and by the Bristol Jewish Society, by the presidents of those organisations. After which point, all hell broke loose. The more than 100 MPs and members of the House of Lords wrote to the university calling for me to be sacked. I was denounced in Parliament on several occasions, etc., etc. A new investigation was put in place, although there'd been no formal complaints. The QC again found that I hadn't said anything anti-Semitic, big surprise, and yet they dismissed me in October 2021. Then I took them to court, to an industrial tribunal, which started on the 16th of October last year, 2023. Just 9 days after the launch of the Al-Aqsa flood operation by the Palestinian resistance. The tribunal reported in February this year, determined that I hadn't been sacked for bringing the students into the debate, which is what the university had said, but I'd been sacked specifically because I had anti-Zionist views, and it was those anti-Zionist views which had specifically caused the university to dismiss me. I was therefore wrongfully dismissed, and I had been discriminated against on the basis of my anti-Zionist views. And that's where we are now. The process is not finished. The university has appealed, and there will be a further hearing in perhaps March or April next year, where we will find out whether the courts believe that the judgment was correct. I believe they will find that's the case.
And I'm asking for a specific reason, yeah. The court found that criticizing Zionism as a political ideology does not inherently equate anti-Semitism, right? I think this is a very important little detail. Please elaborate.
Well, look, the Zionists have for more than 50 years, I mean, really back to before the creation of the State of Israel, but let's take 50 years, advanced the idea that, to quote the former foreign minister of the Zionist entity, Abba Eban, in a speech in 1972, that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. And they've tried to promote this idea for a long, long time, including through all their international diplomatic efforts on the question of anti-Semitism, to try and redefine anti-Semitism so that it means criticism of what they call the world's only Jewish state, as if criticizing Israel could be inherently anti-Semitic because there's no other Jewish states, and obviously you're criticizing the Jews, etc. So they've tried to make that, to blur that distinction, and they've tried to do that through, first of all, running it through the Mossad in the 1980s, who got together with a whole load of Zionist groups in the UK, in France and Germany, and in the US, and then through something which was created in around about the year 2000, the Global Forum on Combating Anti-Semitism, which tried to come up with a working definition of anti-Semitism. First of all, they got this working definition lodged with the European Fundamental Rights Agency, which used to be called the European Monitoring Centre on Xenophobia, in around about 2004-5, and then that was eventually dropped by the European Union Monitoring Centre, and they went into a bit of a panic in around 2013. They determined at the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism they had to find some other place to lodge this working definition so that they could, use that to beat Palestinian supporters over the head. And of course, they found a place to put it, and that was, of course, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, an organization which had been set up by the Israelis. And they lodged it there in 16, and they've ever since used that as the stick with which to beat the pro-Palestine movement. In fact, the weapon of choice, first of all, you go for anti-Semitism. If you can't go for that, well, then perhaps you'll go for terrorism as the weapon of choice. And they use that weapon of choice throughout all of their front groups and proxies and assets and agents all over the world. And that is many, many thousands of organizations. And that's how they do it. That's how they enforce this idea, or try to enforce this idea that there is no distinction. And of course, my case is one of the first cases, I believe, anywhere in the world where a court has judged that there is a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and that the anti-Zionism which I espouse and espoused in court documents, written in my witness statement, was worthy of respect in a democratic society. That's the technical language from the Equality Act, the UK's Equality Act, and was therefore not the opposite of that, which the University of Bristol was trying to maintain, which is akin to Nazism. So we got this judgment that actually that anti-Zionism is anti-racist and is worthy of respect. Is not a form of racism. It's not anti-Semitic, and that, of course, is a major legal victory.
It is, and for viewers who may not be as familiar with the topic, as recently, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I heard Netanyahu speak. If you're against Israel, you're an anti-Semite. Yeah, if you're anti-Zionist, you're also. Also, he tries really very hardly to, also with a lot of effort, to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Why is this important? Now, that in that way, if they succeed, they could stifle any legitimate critic at the state of Israel, and this is exactly what they're intending to.
Well,
So
of course.
that's why this is why your case is extremely important. Now, I these days, like anybody else, I use ChatGPT for my research, and before I have a couple of pointers what I found. Yeah, I know that ChatGPT is extremely Israel biased, and I made even a video about it. Yeah, so I used historical facts, undisputed historical facts, which are not in favor of Israel. I ask it, did this happen? No, 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 maybe, 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 yes. I have 3 examples. Yeah, I put the link in the description, so I know it's biased. And I tell you why I'm highlighting this. But first, what did ChatGPT say that you are most criticized for? So, framing Zionism as a global force driving Islamophobia, number one. We can talk about this, yeah. Accusing Jewish lobby groups to disproportionate influence over political systems, specifically in the US. Making statements about Jewish students that were seen as, yeah, contributing to an unsafe environment for them. And last one, his escalating rhetoric on Zionism and Jewish involvement in political and social issues, which many feel, which may felt crossed into no, which many felt crossed into anti-Semitic tropes. And in these answers, you can already hear the bias because his escalating rhetoric. Where is the neutrality here? There are a couple of other qualifiers in there. Yeah? Anyway, in a nutshell, these are the points that you are, according to ChatGPT, most criticized for. Did ChatGPT forget anything?
Well,
The point that you're most criticized for.
I suppose the thing I would be most criticised for would be the pawns comment, which was one of the ones which was controversial in 2021. But also more recently than that, and this was raised in the tribunal, was the tweets I sent about Jews not being discriminated against, which is based on research. So yeah, I mean, look, this is what they do. I saw there was one of the ones there referred to Jewish lobby groups. Well, I don't talk about Jewish lobby groups. I talk about Zionist lobby groups, and I'm not using Zionist as a code for Jews, because of course we're talking about a formal set of institutions which constitutes the Zionist movement, and that's what I've been doing research on for many years now. And my basic point is, look, there are formal organizations. There's a formal organization called the World Zionist Organization, which is based in Israel, and which has many hundreds, thousands of members around the world. And all of the organizations which are affiliated with the World Zionist Organization are formally Zionist, and that's simply a matter of fact. And you can't just displace that onto say, oh, he's talking about Jewish organizations. Well, no, you're talking about organizations which refer to themselves as being Zionist and which all sign up to the same manifesto. And so, this is a matter of social science, not a matter of targeting Jewish organizations or Jewish students. That's the rhetoric they want to say. They want to say this is all about the Jews and it's not about Zionism. No, it's about Zionism.
What made you especially interesting for me, I'm a behavior analyst, are the publications like A Century of Spin. I'm not sure if you're aware, it's no longer available on Amazon, at least not in hard or soft copy, only in ebook. Yeah, I tried to buy it.
Okay.
Then you have the Israel lobby and the European Union. Very interesting topic. Yeah. Then you are co-founder or founder of Spinwatch. Maybe briefly describe what it does, how it can be found, etc.
Well, Spinwatch is a website, spinwatch.org, which reports on propaganda, lobbying, and power politics. And there's an associated website, a wiki website called powerbase.info, which catalogues, influence, politics, etc. It was set up by a non-profit company called Public Interest Investigations in 2005 as a result of two things. One, the invasion of Iraq and the propaganda surrounding that. We did a book on Iraq, back in 2003 or four. And also the second thing was because we'd had experience of lobbying for lobbying transparency. That was, we had done academic research on lobbying in Scotland, in the UK, at the EU level, with the Commission and the Parliament, and we had made an argument that lobbyists should have to declare who their clients are and what they do for their clients, in much the same way as it's done in the US at the federal level, and indeed with the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is a useful piece of legislation, I think, in the US. And we argued that there should be proper lobbying transparency, and so Spinwatch was an organisation which was set up to pursue that campaigning activity, because we felt that as academics it was difficult to make the academic argument outside of the sort of rhythms of academic life. And we had previously made the argument, for example, at the Standards Committee at the Scottish Parliament, and indeed at the Standards Committee in the UK Parliament, and at the committee in the European Parliament. I forget the name of it, and we'd actually won transparency legislation. There now is lobbying transparency legislation in Scotland, in the UK and regulations in the EU, which we were part of winning. Now, the regulations are not very good, and they would need massive improvement, etc., etc. But we were part of the battle to open up lobbying transparency, and that's part of course of how I got into the question of Zionism. Because on the one hand, we have the question of propaganda, which we were studying in relation to Iraq and other conflicts, Afghanistan. And then on the other hand, we had the question of lobbying, and of course they both come together quite nicely in the question of Zionism.
And I would really like to come back to lobbying, yeah. But before we do, there's another publication. I'm not sure. It's a book from 2009, The War on Terror and Lessons from Northern Ireland. In a nutshell, how does it relate to, let's say, the Israel-Palestine conflict, in lack of a better word, or the global war on terror?
Well, I did my PhD on the conflict in the north of Ireland. It was published in 1994. It's quite a long time ago now. And I did some more work on Ireland after that, including a book called Rethinking Northern Ireland, which tried to set the conflict in the north of Ireland into its proper context, which is the colonial context. So in that work, what we did was we looked at the way in which people have understood the conflict in the north of Ireland and indeed Ireland in general, and criticised the vast majority of academia for not understanding the colonial relationship that was there. People instead they wanted to say, oh well, it was to do with religion, or it was to do with nationalism, or it was to do etc. etc. There were two nations in Ireland. No, I mean it was a colonial conflict, and it was a settler colonial conflict, and because of my understanding of that, it made much easier for me to understand the question of Palestine, because of course it's very much a settler colonial conflict, just like Algeria was, just like South Africa, just like Zimbabwe. And that's how to understand the conflict. And so it didn't take me a long time to get to that way of understanding the conflict, the occupation of Palestine. And when we came to do work on Zionism, I already had that underlying understanding. But maybe I should say how we got to the question of Zionism. Now, I started to study Zionism by mistake, really. I mean, it was because in doing work on the war on terror and the eruption of Islamophobia as a result of the war on terror, we started to look at some think tanks in the UK who were pushing Islamophobic policies in Westminster and Whitehall in policy discussions. And these think tanks, the Centre for Social Cohesion, the Policy Exchange, and then the Henry Jackson Society, which the Centre for Social Cohesion was folded into during this period. And we did some work on these organisations and looked at what they were up to, and wrote some reports on these, including those. There was a chapter in, I think it was two different reports, on the finances of these organisations, which of course was difficult to find, but we, being researchers, looked it up, and we looked up what we could of which organisations were funding the Henry Jackson Society and the Policy Exchange and their work on Islam. And this is part of what led to me being sacked in the end, because the 2 minutes 44 that I spent discussing Zionism in the lecture on Islamophobia in February 2019, I start off by talking about the research which we did, which shows that I think of the top 13 funders of the Henry Jackson Society, I believe it was, 12 of them were charities, which were for us then obscure organisations, which had in their titles had the name of an individual who had set the organisation up or in whose name it was set up, and we didn't know what these organisations were. What is this? So we examined these charities, and we examined what else they did, and of course, in many cases they did philanthropy and funded the opera or art or theatre or whatever. But in addition to that, they also, all of them, funded either illegal settlements in Palestine, or aspects of the occupation forces, or other elements of the Zionist project, including Zionist organisations in the UK and elsewhere. So we concluded eventually, that these were organisations which were Zionist organisations, and it took me a long time really to come around to the way of thinking about these organisations, which was that these were Zionist family foundations, and they were dedicated to supporting Zionism. And that's partly why we started to say, look, Zionists are pushing Islamophobia, because they were funding these think tanks in order to push anti-Islam policies. And that's where it came from. It came from research. And when we started to do that, then I remember the first time we launched the first report in the House of Commons, and there were two Zionists in the audience who got up and started heckling and asking difficult questions, and they were accusing me of being an anti-Semite, and I was just sort of perplexed. What are they talking about? How 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 is that anti-Semitism? And so I didn't understand really what Zionism was at that stage. I mean, I had a vague idea, and I understood the question of settler colonialism, but then I started to understand that they were accusing me of anti-Semitism, and I therefore wanted to understand what it was that they meant, and what they were saying, and what was the evidential basis for it. Maybe I was a secret anti-Semite after all, and I would find it out. So that's what led me to investigate Zionism directly. And of course, after that, you can see that we start to do work on the Israel lobby, as it's called. So we did a report on BICOM, the main pro-Israel PR operation in the UK, and then subsequently other work. You mentioned one on the EU and other research on the Zionist movement. And I started to come to an understanding that this was broader than the Israel lobby, and that in order to understand what was happening here, not just in the attacks that I got, but in the role of Zionism in governance in the UK and the US and other places, as well as in occupied Palestine, that you had to understand that there was such a thing as the Israel lobby. Yes, it was powerful. Yes, and that Mearsheimer and Walt in their book of 2005 or six were correct about that, and Ilan Pappé is correct about that in his most recent book, which has just come out this year, on the Zionist lobby, as he calls it. But there was something else going on there which was important, which people weren't understanding. So people discuss the lobby as these organizations which try and influence policy. And yes, they exist, they are important, they are well funded, and they have power. But there's something more that the Zionist movement does, which is broader than just the Israel lobby. And that means that you, I think, have to study the Zionist movement directly. And if you look through Ilan Pappé's book or Mearsheimer and Walt's book, there's hardly any mention of the Zionist movement, and hardly any conception there is such a thing as the Zionist movement. Now, let me tell you why I think the Zionist movement as an object of study is crucially important. The lobby, yes, it influences policy, but the Zionist movement, it has other functions, and those other functions include, in particular, the indoctrination, grooming, and radicalization of Jewish youth. That is a crucial aspect of the work of the Zionist movement, which is not accomplished by the Israel lobby. It's not done by AIPAC. They don't do that. It's done by the main elements of the Zionist movement, which is, of course, in every country that it's organized, the Jewish National Fund, the equivalent of the UK's United Jewish Israel Appeal, which is the main fundraiser for Israel, and, of course, the Jewish Agency, which has an office in most places. It doesn't have a formal organization, it has an office. And these are the three elements of the Zionist movement who organized the colonization and occupation of Palestine. The Jewish National Fund is there to steal the land. The UJIA, or Keren Hazod, its head office, is there to provide the money for stealing the land and for bringing the settlers who are organized by the Jewish Agency. That's the main elements of the Zionist movement. These are not Israel lobby tasks. These are Zionist movement tasks. And of course, what else the Zionist movement does, in addition to the Israel lobby, is it's not just radicalizing its youth, but also recruiting youth from around the world to go and fight in the IDF, which of course is a key function, and also to become settlers, to go and steal the Palestinians' land, to go and live on Palestinian territory, and also to financially support all of the organizations accomplishing the settlement activity. Now, all of that activity is not what the Israel lobby does. It's crucially important in the subjugation and the genocide that we currently see happening in Gaza. Yes, of course, the Israel lobby has a role in that, but the Zionist movement is a much broader organization, set of organizations, and therefore you need to directly study the Zionist movement. And my interest in that comes, directly out of being accused of being an anti-Semite and wanting to understand who these people were.
Wow, you packed a lot of information in there. I don't know if you know her. I interviewed Nurit Peled El Hanan. She's the sister of Miko Peled.
Yeah,
Just for the viewers, her grandfather was a co-signatory of Israel's Charter of Independence, and her father was a general in the 1967 war. And she researched racism in Israeli school books.
yeah,
That where she shows that basically Israelis themselves, that's how they're the first victims of their own propaganda, and it starts right after kindergarten.
yeah,
And she calls it literally the pornography of evil. Children are being fed the pornography of evil to scare them, to scare the hell out of them, not from the Nazis, but from the Arabs.
yeah,
There
yeah,
is a there's a documentary. It's up here. It's called Defamation from 2015 from a young Israeli filmmaker, where he actually shows that, yeah, how they bring the young children. Is it true? I would say somewhere around 10, 12, 8, 10, 12, 14, yeah, to Poland, to the Holocaust Museum, etc. You virtually see them breaking down, crying, thinking the whole world wants to kill them. You also see in this documentary where they try to speak with Polish residents, which they don't understand, do not understand a single word, and then when the kids are being interviewed, what was going on here? Yeah, they're anti-Semitic. They want to threaten us. They want to kill us. Yeah, the old guy, they were three old guys. They were just laughing. Hey, what did she want? Yeah, something like this. It's so deep ingrained. It's unbelievable.
yes. I mean, look, that of course is what happens in occupied Palestine, but it also happens in everywhere else that the Zionist movement is organized. You said after kindergarten. Well, no, it starts in kindergarten. The formal Zionist propaganda starts in kindergarten. There are in this country, in the UK, 135 or so Jewish schools. Um, Most of them are Zionist schools. I mean, formally, they say they're Zionist schools. I mean, I don't realize this until recently, and then some of those schools have kindergartens associated in which they are engaged in propagandizing the kids, and it's all the way through primary school, through secondary school, through the youth groups. They have a whole range of different youth groups. I mean, the Zionist movement's a broad movement, so there are socialist, more than one sort of socialist youth groups. There are religious Zionist youth groups. There are revisionist Zionist youth groups. There are conservative Zionist youth groups, and they have people. They take people every week. They encourage them in the propaganda. They offer every 16-year-old Jew a free trip to Israel. In addition to, of course, their Auschwitz visits, and these are all mechanisms to try and encourage those people to believe that they have. I mean, they call the tours, they call the tours birthright tours, to encourage young British Jews, young German Jews, young French Jews, American, Argentinian, Brazilian Jews, that they have a birthright to steal Palestinian land. And that's, deeply racist and deeply damaging to those individuals, because of course some of them go on to become settler colonists. Some of them go to, I mean, many thousands of them actually join the occupation forces. I saw reports from 2016 in the Israeli press saying that thousands and thousands of those who've joined the IDF are from France. So 5% of the foreign fighters with the IDF are from the UK. This was back in 2016. And something like 12 to 15% were from the US. And of course, there are others from South Africa, from Argentina, from Brazil, some from India, and from other countries where there's an active Zionist movement, Australia as well, of course. So this is a worldwide effort, yes, to influence policy in the UK and the US, etc., which they do very effectively, but also to encourage people to be recruited to come and commit genocide. And that's what the purpose of the movement is.
This is where this perpetual existential threat comes in.
Yeah.
Israel needs to be able to project this image of being, in mortal danger all the time, to get all those resources. I think Emeritus Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro told me Zionism is burning Jews as fuel. I think this was a very powerful statement.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, it's like with the question of Ukraine, isn't it? That the Zelensky sends these troops, or the NATO sends these troops into the Russian meat grinder. Yeah, of course, that's true. But of course, there's also there's also a hierarchy of Jews within Zionism, right? I mean, there's the good Jews, the strong Jews, who are able to become the settler colonists and to create a new the new Jew with the creation of the state of Israel. Then there are the bad, weak Jews who are the ones who are either anti-Zionist or who succumb to the Nazis, etc., etc. So they have a lot of that stuff going on as well.
Mm. You just said Nazis. I don't know if you can comment, yeah, but paradoxically, those right-wing groups today, they are all pro-Israel, right? So in without much thinking about it, I would have I would have thought, Nazis, neo-Nazis, yeah, they're all against Israel, but the opposite is true, yeah, and there is apparently a concerted effort from Israel going on to kind of groom these kind of groups. I don't know if you can comment on it.
Well, there's a lot to say about this, and again, with many of these things, there's a lot of research still needs to be done about all this stuff. But let me just give you two examples. One is the example of Ukraine. The original um, creation of Ukrainian nationalism in the 1920s and 30s. The Ukrainian nationalists believed that they should have autonomy from the Russians and they should create militias to police their own people. And they came to an agreement with the Jews of Ukraine, those who represented elements of the Jewish community in Ukraine, that the Jews could be recognized as a nation too, and that they could have militias for policing their own people too, and that was an agreement, and that was an agreement which was made with a guy called Simon Petliura, who was of course responsible for pogroms against the Jews, but there was an agreement made with Petliura by Vladimir Jabotinsky, the father of revisionist Zionism. And he makes a comment somewhere about this will be on his gravestone. He was the guy who made the deal with the Nazis, and Petliura, of course, was later assassinated in Paris by a Jewish Russian anarchist as a result of his pogroms against the Jews. But nevertheless, the Zionists have this connection. And let's remember that the Jews in Ukraine, the first settlement of Jews in Ukraine came after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, and they settled in Odessa, along with other settler colonies too. But Odessa was a settler colony. And I often think about this, about the emergence of Zionism as a political project, which more or less originates in Odessa, and the Pinskers.
And way before the Holocaust,
Yeah,
way before the Holocaust.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about the 1800s, yeah. And Pinsker's Lovers of Zion, which is a forerunner of the Zionist movement in the mid 1880s, was from Odessa, right? And so they had this idea that that the Jews were a nation and therefore that they could police themselves. And the only reason that the Ukrainian nationalists and the Jewish nationalists would have to cooperate would be if they were attacked by the Russians. So the deal was, yes, we'll attack the Russians, but apart from that, we're separate. And so you see the parallels there are between Ukrainian nationalism and the early Zionism, and those parallels don't go away just by wanting them to go away. There are some Jews in Ukraine who were very much anti-Nazi in the contemporary period after 2014. One of the key leaders, I forget his name now, who's very, very critical of the Azov battalion, etc., etc. And that's a tendency within the Jewish community, but there's also a tendency within the Jewish community of being pro-Azov. I mean, in fact, one of the co-founders of the Azov battalion, the Nazi battalion, not proto-Nazi, not neo-Nazi, the actual Nazi battalion of the Azov battalion, was a guy called Natan Kazan. And what military formation had he previously been in? He was in the IDF. I mean, he was in the IDF. The co-founder of Azov had been in the IDF, and so I mean, there we are. That there are those parallels. Now, let me give you the second example, which is to come up.
Before you do, in a nutshell, explain a bit Kazov. I mean, I know this is this Nazi military unit. They are very fond of Bandera,
Yeah.
but a bit more information.
Well, I mean, I was talking about Petliura and the evolution of the Ukrainian nationalists. Of course, Bandera comes along after Petliura is the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists, and of course, they were involved in the pogroms of the Second World War and execution of Jews, and of course, others, gypsy travelers and communists, etc. And of course, Azov inherit the mantle or tradition of Bandera, along with the various other far right groups, and of course, they were key muscle in the coup in 2014, which of course leads to then the conflict with the Donbass, and we fast forward to the Russian special military operations. So I mean that's that. So the other point I was going to make was about the link between the Zionists and the far right. Now look, so we already have those elective affinities between the far right and Zionism. They're similar sorts of ideas, it seems to me. But nevertheless, in the post-war period, post-45 period, the far right tends to be Judeophobic, anti-Jewish, and therefore also anti-Israel. And so what happens in around 2009-10 is that there's a major push from Zionist forces, largely from the US. So these are US think tanks, the Center for Security Policy, the Gatestone Institute, the Middle East Forum, well known as key elements of the Islamophobia network in the US. And they start to get involved in Europe. And they start to be involved in funding and organizing, directly organizing, something which comes to be known from its first meetings as the Counter-Jihad Europa movement. And so you have Counter-Jihad Denmark and Counter-Jihad Netherlands, and you have similar movements in many other European countries, in Switzerland, in Austria, in France, in Germany, in the UK. And these movements were started effectively by US Zionist money. And people don't understand that. And of course, the deal was you stop with the Judeophobia, stop with the anti-Israel stuff, convert yourself to Zionists, become Judeophiles, and make sure that your primary enemy is the bad people, and that is the Muslims.
The Arabs, yes. Yes.
Well, of course, the Arabs are a subset of the Muslims, right? So, and again, this is about the Zionists pushing Islamophobia. One of the reasons that, that the complaints were taken about me in the first place. So, what we have there is the creation of this counter-jihad movement, and people don't understand that this is something which was deliberately fostered by Zionist money and Zionist organizational acumen. Now, in the UK, where the similar process happens, and the UK leg of the counter-jihad movement was the English Defence League, led by a guy called Tommy Robinson, or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, to give his proper name. And now the meeting at which the English Defence League was created and Tommy was given the role of being in charge, there were 5 people in the room. One was the funder, or one of the funders of the English Defence League, and 2 of the others were from the Center for Security Policy, the US think tank, which was creating the counter-jihad movement. So 20%, 40%, sorry, of the people in the room, including Tommy, at the meeting which founded the English Defence League, were actually Zionist emissaries who were providing money. One of them was a key funder, and also organizational ability. So the social media of the English Defence League in those early years was actually run directly by an operative of the Centre for Security Policy, who also ran the social media of many of the other counter-jihad organizations across Europe, including Counter-Jihad Europa, the specific European umbrella body. So this is an operation. And people don't understand that. They think, oh, well, and people have said this recently when I've said that the riots in the UK were effectively riots for Israel. And people say, oh, well, the far right, these are the far right. The far right's the same as it always was. The far right will take money from wherever it can. Oh, look, Tommy Robinson's been to Poland. Look, he's associating with the far right in Poland. So what are you talking about? Well, actually, did the Polish far right give Tommy Robinson money? No. Where did they get the money from? He got it from the Zionists. Not only from the Zionists, but a large part of it. And they continue to support him to this day, including, of course, most recently when he was arrested in Canada in the summer. And he was bailed out by a guy called Ezra Levant, who runs Rebel Media in Canada, which, of course, and Ezra is, of course, a hardline Zionist. Big surprise, there we are. That's how it operates.
The challenge going forward is, of course, that we're seeing globally, and that includes the US, a move to the right. I mean, we don't even have to talk about Israel, yeah? But these forces that you're describing on the right getting stronger and stronger with the association and affiliations with a repressive regime as Israel. And when we talk about, and again, not knowing if you can comment, yeah, if you talk about the weapons industry of Israel, the lab, yeah, where they use Palestine basically as a lab and as a selling predicate weapons, battle tested weapons. But these sophisticated and intelligent weapons, they come to us. Sooner or later, you will have it in your town. Why? Because there's a larger and larger demographic in the West of excluded, disenfranchised young population, which has to be suppressed. So these, you have certain storm cells, they could combine to a superstorm sooner or later. And this is where I think the whole Israel, how shall I say it? It's relevant for the globe. It's not just a localized, Middle Eastern problem, what we are seeing. It's expanding.
Well, I mean, I think that there is a lot to say about that. I mean, what I would say is that if you think about this at the global level, we're seeing a realignment in the world from the unipolar US dominance towards multipolarity.
Yeah.
And of course, there's lots of complexities towards that. But let's say, of course, we know the increasing role of Russia, of China, of Iran as really important world powers as part of that process. And of course, they're all aligned in the BRICS, and in many other ways they are aligned too in terms of joint exercises, etc. So we know about all that, and that, of course, is having a depleting effect on the power of America. And I think you see that in particular in the inability of the US and the UK and the Seychelles and whoever else is in their alliance to defeat the government of Yemen, Ansarallah, or quite often called the Houthis, because
Saudi Arabia bombed Yemen for 10 years and they didn't reach anything.
they did. And then what happened was that the Chinese came along and made a deal with Iran, and the Saudis had to get out. And of course, the Ansarallah had already captured huge amounts of Saudi equipment, much of which would come, of course, from the US. And so that's one of the key elements of the reason why the US can't defeat Ansarallah. Yes, of course, Ansarallah no doubt has all sorts of Iranian weapons, very sophisticated weapons they are, too, by all counts. But the reason that the Americans can't go in too hard on Ansarallah is they know, and they let this be known through the pages of the New York Times at the time, they know that if they do seriously attack Yemen, that Yemen has weapons which can turn US naval warships, purveyors of projectors of US power, into floating metal targets, and they can sink aircraft carriers. And the Americans know that. And so that's why there's a standoff there. That's why when they first bombed Yemen, they rang up Ansarallah and said, "Look, guys, we've got to bomb you. So if you don't mind, get your guys out, and and so no one was hurt. I mean, there were some small casualties, to be fair, and so that's an indication that the US cannot just walk in wherever it wants anymore, and that actually, given the advances in technology, the hypersonic missiles, which both the Russians and the Iranians, I imagine the Chinese too, but I don't know about that. But yeah, certainly the Russians and the Iranians have. These are technologies which are able to evade all of the highest tech equipment which the US has, and they are now, of course, as we know, just last week, sending in their THAAD air defense systems to Israel, because all of the air defense systems that Israel has were unable to stop the Iranian missiles. They just simply evade the air defense systems. So that's a real problem for them, that the military power of the US is on the wane.
You said Iranian missiles. I just returned from Jordan, where I had the chance to interview 4 top diplomats. And in the evening, we were sitting in a restaurant, and suddenly a son calls and says, "Hey, the house is shaking. The house is shaking." That was before it became known that the rockets from Iran to Israel were already flying. And then we received, again, I was there, then we received from all kinds of Arab sources video clips which clearly show impacts.
Yes.
I thought half of Tel Aviv is destroyed. And yet, in the coming days after this attack, we hear, oh, nothing happened, nobody died, no significant damage, this kind of thing. So I'm still today, I'm puzzled. I know what I saw those video clips, and still today I don't hear anything. I'm totally puzzled.
Well, yeah, look, of course, there was an attempt to minimize the damage and to go, the Iranians can't even kill people and they only killed a Palestinian. Of course, But let's be clear that what happened there was that there was an agreement between the Iranians and the Americans. The Iranians rang up the Americans and said, "Look, guys, we're going to do this, but we're not going to
That
kill
was
anyone."
disputed. That was disputed by the Pentagon from several guys. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I just say it was officially disputed by the Pentagon. They
And
said we didn't have any prior information. Yeah.
they had 2 hours' notice, is my understanding. And of course, that's what allowed the Israelis to put their F-35s up in the air and evaded destruction, as I understand it. I mean, there were accounts at the time of 15 F-35s being destroyed. As I understand it, they had enough time to get their F-35s up in the air. But nevertheless,
But sorry. Did you say Iran destroyed F-35s, 15 pieces?
there,
Did you
there,
say?
there were reports at the time that was the case. I thought,
Exactly. At the very evening, we received a report that actually Iran succeeded in destroying a X number of F-35s at the
yeah,
very same evening. Yeah.
that's right. I saw those reports too. Now, I don't know if that report was true or not, but certainly it seems to be the case that they had enough time, 2 hours notice, to get their F-35s up in the air. So some of them at least will have evaded destruction. But what we now hear in the most recent disclosures that there have been is that almost every single Iranian missile hit the precise target it was aimed at, including bases in the Golan, the Unit 8200 top secret bunker in the top of the
Yeah.
mountain, the ORT Tel Nof base, which is near Tel Aviv, the base, the Nevatim base in the Nakab Desert, which is where the F-35s had taken off to bomb Beirut from, and indeed to bomb Damascus when they bombed the Iranian consulate there. And all these targets, it appears, were hit. I'm even hearing reports and seen footage of uh, the most advanced air defenses that the Israelis had at the time being destroyed by the missiles. Of course, what they do is what one does in these circumstances. I'm not an expert on on such matters, but they send up a whole load of drones and missiles in order to attract air defense to fire at
Yeah.
them.
To saturate it.
Uh,
Yeah.
which,
Yeah. To saturate it. Yeah.
yes, of course, to saturate it. And of course, the Iron Dome is overwhelmed by if there are missiles from different directions, as of course Hezbollah and the Iraqi resistance and the Ansarullah knows, but also to pinpoint the locations of the air defense systems, at which point they can then be taken out. And of course, that's what Hezbollah has been doing for the last year on the border, 5 kilometers from the border. And so that all of that happened, and then of course they hit. It appears hit every one of the targets that they went for with pinpoint accuracy. That's like within feet of the intended target. And I think that it appears now that let's give the Zionists a lot of pause for thought. Indeed, also the fact that Hezbollah was able to just the other day hit the Golani base, some great distance from the Lebanese border, with such accuracy, with a barrage of missiles. And of course, they're saying 4 soldiers died, but we don't know exactly how many died, but they were also it was also being reported there were more than 100 casualties. And of course, people have seen the footage of the blood on the floor in that base, etc. So that the Israelis know that the technology arraigned against them is much more significant than in 2006 when they last went into Lebanon, and that the Iranians have missiles which can strike at will. And that's why, of course, the Americans have sent in their high-tech THAAD air defences, but they won't be effective either, I don't think. I mean, apparently this is the case. And so what the problem they've got is, yes, of course, they've got superiority with their air force. And, the Palestinians don't have an air force, Hezbollah don't have an air force. And actually, the Iranians don't have an air force which can match that of the IDF, but they have absolute superiority, it would appear, in missile technology. And they could, as they've been threatening, they could take out the whole of Israel in one strike. But that, obviously that hasn't happened yet. And maybe it's propaganda to some extent. But it does appear that the Iranians have much superior technology to Israel, as indeed to the Russians, who, let's remember, are on the border with the occupied Golan in Syria. They have border observation posts. You can Google there are images of these on the internet. And of course, the Russian flights are going up and down the coast of Syria to try and dissuade the Zionists from attacking Damascus. Not very effectively, it has to be said, but that they are there and they are engaged in this to some extent.
Talking about targets very briefly. So Nasrallah's headquarters was bombed in Beirut, right? So Israeli bombed like 6 complete blocks in order to get this one with one man, arguing, of course, that Hezbollah hides in behind civilian as human shields.
Yeah.
However, Iran almost hit Mossad's HQ in Tel Aviv. They didn't hit it, to my knowledge. They hit the street in front of it or something. Yeah? And immediately, you can see the biased, Western media.
Sure.
Iran indiscriminately, yeah, as if any nation would put its HQ somewhere in the wilderness on the mountaintop. If we still have an opportunity, I still would like to discuss a little bit a century of spin.
Okay.
Can we relate it to what's going on right now? I know it's focused on corporate PR, but can we relate it? Can we connect it to the conflict?
Well, I mean, the the propaganda apparatus which attends the conflict is of course hugely significant, I mean, I think we don't. I think people, yes, they understand that the US and the UK military or that the Israeli military are engaged in propaganda in the abstract. Of course, people understand there's such a thing as the IDF spokesperson's unit, etc. But I think that there's a failure to understand just the kind of the depths and extent of propaganda activities that states, especially Western states, conduct. And I think that's one thing which I've come to appreciate, partly as a result of writing that book, because that writing that book on the history of public relations and propaganda from the late 19th century to the present uh, attunes you to the deceptions which were made in the past, which didn't appear to be deceptions at the time. So, starting off with the famous examples of Edward Bernays, relative, of course, of
Nephew of Sigmund Freud. Yes, yes.
and his work for the tobacco industry. I mean, that early, maybe that early deception is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, persuading debutantes to march down Fifth Avenue in New York and had a prearranged sign to bring out the cigarettes, which would be
Torches of freedom.
which would be called
Torches of
Torches of Freedom,
freedom.
which would be so you would be aligning the selling of tobacco to the suffragette movement. I mean, that's clever, right? And of course, that helped, as all the records suggest, to break into the women's market for smoking and to therefore to kill millions of American women. And that the way in which that's done as a kind of covert strategy. So he paid the photographer to skulk in the doorway and to pop out at the relevant moment. And the women who were doing it didn't know that they were effectively being set up. And so it appears to be a news event. And of course, it was entirely set up by Edward Bernays. And that kind of duplicity and front groups, etc., is something which is really very important, and which perhaps that allows me to recognise these things more when they happen now than would otherwise be the case. I mean, so let me to give an example. The way in which, for example, the British intelligence services operate to manipulate political and media debate. So we saw a leak in 2000 and what was it, 18, of files from a thing called the Integrity Initiative. And the Integrity Initiative was one project being run, funded by MI6, uh, to to counter Russian propaganda. It was said, and it turned out that this was a project which was actually undermining the elected leader of the opposition. And it was run from a think tank in London, headed by an honorary colonel in military intelligence, and where the chief operating officer of the think tank had been parachuted in to keep MI6's eye on military intelligence, because obviously MI6 think military intelligence is a bit of a joke, so they have to have an MI6 officer. This happens all the time apparently. In as the chief operating officer, and this guy, he's actually called Guy Spindler, was the MI6 officer keeping an eye on this project. Now, this project was one of a large number of projects aiming to manipulate and manufacture popular ideas about the Russians and about the left in the UK. And they had this whole network which was revealed in all the documents, and all these journalists were on the named in the documents. And when the journalists were asked, they said, "Oh, I didn't know anything about it. It's nothing to do with me, Governor. Honest, you know." But you could see that that's what was happening, and the same was the case in relation to the MI6 projects in Syria, for example, where there was an alleged uprising, which of course was exploited by MI6 and by the CIA, and the MI6 transported a whole bunch of fighters which they trained and groomed in Libya to topple Colonel Gaddafi, the Libyan Islamic fighting group originally. And they transported them to Syria. They started this revolution, and along with that military activity, they funded a huge variety of civil society groups, of PR firms, and other consultancies to provide an entire narrative of the conflict in Syria, which was entirely false, which was that it was a revolution and an uprising against the terrible dictator Assad, etc., etc. I mean, huge numbers of contracts to huge numbers of groups based in Jordan, based in Turkey, and in surrounding states, including some in Lebanon. Of course, they've got many projects in Lebanon, etc. So that people don't understand that actually almost everything they heard from Syria had come from MI6 cutouts. I mean, it's extraordinary. MI6 led that element of the project. The CIA wasn't so involved. It was MI6 who were doing that, and people have no idea that actually that these were, effectively MI6 propaganda done through deniable contractors who are part of. I mean, you can actually track some of it through something called the Conflict and Security Fund, which is where the money comes from, and that they have to disclose where that money goes on the Foreign Office website. But these are MI6 contractors, and so when I sort of say this to people, they look at me like I'm mad. They think, but Assad's a terrible butcher, and this was a revolution, and this is ISIS, and you say, yes, let's have a little look. And I got into this, of course, through the question of chemical weapons attacks. None of which were done by the Syrian government, and I mean, extraordinarily, of course, all of the purpose of this was to say the Syrians are using chemical weapons, therefore we have to have direct NATO intervention. No, the Syrians weren't doing this. These were fabricated chemical weapons attacks, including actual chemical agents in some of the cases, two of the key cases, which were either dispersed or were put into samples. So, and people don't understand that, actually. For example, in the Duma case, which is the one I got involved in first of all, where there were 53 or 54 dead civilians, these people were killed before by Western forces. They were probably gassed by diesel exhaust, and then their bodies placed such that they could be the Assad government could be accused of gassing them with chlorine, a gas which didn't kill them, as the toxicology reports from Germany showed later, and which was just a fabrication to try and to encourage Western intervention. Of course, it was done by a US, a Western proxy. In that particular case, Jaish al-Islam, and of course some of the Western proxy forces helped to get the story out. The White Helmets, for example, an organization run by a former British military intelligence operative and overseen by an MI6 operative who was, of course, his wife, something which became apparent only afterwards.
There are striking parallels with the story about the 40 babies, yeah, which Biden even repeated. It's completely debunked, but it's not a new story. We had the same thing in Kuwait during the invasion, where the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, with crocodile tears, testified they took the babies out of the incubator, smashed them on the ground, and we know today, coming back to propaganda,
you can't see it on the ground. You have to see it on the cold, hard floor. Unquote.
Ah. But it was an American PR company. I have
Yeah,
the name somewhere, yeah? But this
Hill,
is all
Hill
public
and Knowlton.
knowledge. It's
It
a
was still Hill and Knowlton, yeah.
ah. So, that's coming back to your book, basically. Century of Spin, corporate PR is used to manufacture consent, to quote Chomsky,
Yeah.
in order to get the population into wars.
Yes, right.
How could people get engaged, David?
Well, I mean,
That's a question I very often hear. What can you do? I'm only one person. What can I do? So how can people get engaged?
there's lots of things people can do, what I would say in particular is that we are past the point of just rhetorical questions, past the point of just having mass demonstrations. What we need to do is to materially impact on the ability of the Zionists to continue their genocide. Now, of course, the main way in which that is being done materially is by the Palestinian resistance and indeed the axis of resistance more widely. But in countries like the UK and other Western countries which are engaged in supporting the genocide, and Germany supplying 30% of the weapons, and the Americans 69% of the weapons, the French and Italians have been given intelligence support. Then what we need to do is to, one, target those governments and directly target those governments as best we can, and two, to directly target the ability of the Zionists to continue with their operations. One, that means, yes, of course, engaging with something like Palestine Action, which is on an almost daily basis attacking Israeli arms firms and those who support them, and actually the courts are finding it very, very difficult to convict them, but also materially dealing with the whole question of these Zionist organizations, which is, there's perhaps 2,000 Zionist organizations in the UK on a daily basis, supplying resources and ideological color to the genocide. So these organizations need all of them to be shut down. And so we need to start to be taking much more direct action against these organizations, strategic complaints, legal processes, and actually demonstrations outside these organizations. I mean, I just did a piece a couple of days ago on, for example, some charities in the UK run by the Lewis family, which are engaged in supporting settlements and the occupation forces. Now they run a UK high street retailer called River Island. So we should be actually boycotting and picketing River Island stores and directly trying to stop the business of these organizations so that they can no longer support the genocide.
If people would like to get
Sorry, and the other thing I should say is, of course, that that I run spinwatch.org and powerbase.info, and we do lots of different research. I have the show Palestine Declassified, and we're always looking for people who are interested to come and help to do research and writing and that kind of thing. So if people want to do that, they can get in touch with me. And of course, on Twitter, I am at tracking_power.
You just preempted my next question. How can people get in touch with you? I think you listed it all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Last one, David. Is there anything that's close to your heart that we didn't cover? Any topic, any whatever, anything?
Oh, there's tons of stuff. I mean, we haven't got. I don't know what specifically I would say, but I mean, I think we are. This is a live stream genocide, and it behooves all of us to do whatever we can. Yes, of course, we demonstrate, and of course, it's important to build the sense that we are together in this, and of course, it's important to show people in Gaza that we support them. But we need to do as much as we can to physically put ourselves in the way of the genocide.
Okay. On that note, David, it was my real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
If this interview got you thinking, questioning, or even arguing with yourself, that's exactly the point. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. Over on my Substack, I take these big ideas and dig even deeper, breaking down the complexities, connecting the dots, and explore what they mean for all of us. Whether it's about today's topic, the next one, or one from the past, my Substack is where the real deep dive happens. So if you're ready for more insights, thought-provoking analysis, and a space to challenge your own perspective, join me there. It's free and the link is in the description below. I can't wait to see what you think.